At 11:21 in the morning, a Japanese rifle round slammed into a sandbag just 6 inches from Second Lieutenant John George's head. Dirt exploded across his face. George dropped behind the ruined bunker wall and froze. Somewhere in the jungle southwest of him, a Japanese sniper had found his position. George waited. 1 minute, 2, 3. Then inch by inch, he raised a rifle that many of his fellow officers had mocked for weeks. It was not standard army equipment. It was not a military sniper rifle. It was a Winchester Model 70, a civilian sporting rifle George had bought with his own money and fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope. His commanding officer had once told him to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon. Now that rifle was the only thing standing between George and a sniper trying to kill him. At 11:38, George finally saw movement high in a banyan tree. He settled the crosshairs, controlled his breathing, and fired. The sniper fell. It was George's 3rd kill that morning, and before the next few days were over, the soldiers who had laughed at his rifle would be asking him to teach them how to do exactly what he had just done. This is the story of John George, the civilian rifle he carried into Guadalcanal, and the deadly sniper hunt that proved skill could sometimes matter more than standard equipment. John George was not an ordinary army marksman. Before America entered the war, he had already built a reputation in competitive shooting. In 1939, at just 23 years old, he won the Illinois State Championship. He could produce tight groups at hundreds of yards, even with iron sights. So when George prepared for deployment, he wanted a rifle that could take advantage of those skills. He purchased a Winchester Model 70 and equipped it with a Lyman Alaskan scope. But there was a problem. His unit shipped out before the rifle arrived. While other soldiers crossed the Pacific cleaning their standard M1 Garands, George's Winchester remained thousands of miles behind in Illinois. So he arranged for the rifle to be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant finally handed George a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle he had been waiting for. Compared with the M1 Garand, the Winchester looked out of place. The Garand was semi-automatic and held 8 rounds. George's Winchester was bolt action and held 5. To some officers, bringing a sporting rifle into a modern war seemed ridiculous. Captain Morris ordered George to leave it behind and carry standard equipment. George ignored the advice. He took the Winchester with him. His regiment had arrived on Guadalcanal after months of brutal fighting. The Marines had captured Henderson Field and survived repeated Japanese attempts to retake it. But Japanese forces still occupied difficult terrain around Mount Austin and west of the Matanikau River. George's battalion spent weeks fighting through bunkers and fortified positions. Yet during those operations, his expensive scoped Winchester saw almost no action. Then the fighting moved toward the jungle groves around Point Cruz. And everything changed. There were no obvious fortifications here. No enemy positions easy to identify. Instead, Japanese soldiers disappeared into enormous trees and dense vegetation. Among them were experienced snipers. They knew the jungle. They understood concealment. And they were patient. According to the account, Japanese snipers operating around Point Cruz had killed 14 men from George's regiment in only 72 hours. A soldier filling canteens at a creek was shot. Patrols were hit. 1 man was killed from a tree. The Americans had already walked past more than once. The battalion needed someone who could find the shooters before the shooters found them. Suddenly, George's unusual rifle no longer looked quite so ridiculous. His commander asked him a simple question. Could he actually hit anything with it? George explained his competitive shooting background. The commander gave him a chance to prove it. Before dawn on January 22nd, George moved into the remains of a captured Japanese bunker overlooking the groves west of Point Cruz. He carried the Winchester, ammunition, and a canteen. No spotter, no radio man. He settled behind cover and began studying the trees through his low-power scope. The jungle was constantly moving. Birds, leaves, insects, branches. The challenge was identifying movement that did not belong. At 9:17, George noticed a branch shift in a banyan tree roughly 240 yards away. There was almost no wind. He watched. The branch moved again. Then the outline of a man appeared between the branches. A Japanese sniper was positioned high in the tree, watching an American supply route. George adjusted his aim, controlled his breathing, squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked. The sniper fell through the branches. George immediately worked the bolt and began searching for another man. He believed a second sniper might be nearby. 26 minutes later, he found movement in another tree. A Japanese soldier was climbing down, apparently trying to escape the compromised position. George fired. The second man fell. 2 shots. 2 kills. The rifle everyone had mocked was beginning to make its argument. Then came the shot that nearly ended George's hunt. At 11:21, a bullet struck only inches from his head. George took cover and searched the southwest. 17 minutes later, he located another sniper high in the trees. George fired again. Another sniper fell. By noon, according to the account, George had killed 5 enemy snipers, and word was spreading. Men who had laughed at the civilian rifle now wanted to watch him operate. George refused. More men around him meant more movement. More movement meant more attention, and attention in a sniper duel could be fatal. The Japanese also began adapting. After the first day's losses, they became more careful about moving in daylight. George could spend hours staring into the trees without seeing anything. The next morning, heavy tropical rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. When the weather finally cleared, George spotted another sniper nearly 300 yards away. He fired. The man fell. Then the Japanese responded with something far more dangerous than a rifle: mortars. Rounds began landing around George's bunker. The first salvo fell short. The next came closer. George understood what was happening. His position had been identified. He grabbed the Winchester and ran. Moments later, mortar fire smashed the bunker he had just abandoned. George relocated behind a fallen tree and continued hunting. The game had changed. He was no longer simply searching for Japanese snipers. They were searching for him. That afternoon, George killed 2 more. After 2 days, he reported 8 confirmed kills. That night, the mathematics were disturbing. If the intelligence estimate was correct, only a few enemy snipers remained, and those survivors had spent 2 days watching their comrades die. They now knew an American marksman was hunting them. They knew roughly where he operated, and they understood what he could do. The easiest targets were gone. The survivors would be smarter. On January 24th, George deliberately chose another position. He avoided the destroyed bunker. He avoided the fallen tree. Instead, he positioned himself around rocks previously used as a machine gun position. After the rain cleared, George spotted a Japanese sniper concealed in a palm. The target looked almost too easy. George began applying pressure to the trigger, then stopped. Something felt wrong. After days of hunting experienced snipers, he understood that obvious opportunities could be traps. So instead of firing immediately, George searched the surrounding trees. For 11 minutes, he examined the jungle. Then he saw another man, high in a banyan tree roughly 80 yards from the first sniper, better hidden, better positioned, watching the area where George had previously operated. The first man appeared to be bait. George decided to turn the trap against them. He fired at the exposed sniper. As the man fell, George swung his rifle toward the concealed shooter. The second sniper reacted to the sound. That tiny movement was all George needed. He fired again. The second man fell. Then George moved immediately. Seconds later, Japanese machine gun fire ripped through the rocks where he had been positioned. Had he remained there after taking the second shot, the rifle that had saved other men might have gotten him killed. George relocated again, eventually settling inside a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. He continued searching. The final phase of the hunt became even stranger. George realized one of the surviving Japanese marksmen was no longer hiding in the trees. He was moving through the vegetation on the ground. The man was stalking toward George's previous position. Instead of waiting to be found, the Japanese sniper was hunting the hunter. George remained almost completely motionless inside the flooded crater. Eventually, he saw that the sniper was not alone. Another Japanese soldier was covering the movement from farther away. George faced a serious problem. With a bolt-action rifle, engaging two alert opponents at the same time was dangerous. After the first shot, he would have to operate the bolt before firing again. That delay might be enough for the second man to shoot him. So George did nothing. He lowered himself deeper into the muddy water and waited. Eventually, the Japanese soldiers concluded George had moved farther east. They began advancing. They passed his position. Their backs were now exposed. George rose from the crater. He aimed at the closer man, fired, worked the bolt, shifted to the second, fired again. Both men fell. The immediate sniper threat had been destroyed. But George's problems were not over. Japanese voices suddenly came from the tree line. Multiple infantrymen were approaching the bodies. George dropped back into the crater. The soldiers moved closer, then closer again. They had discovered tracks in the mud. At the crater rim, George was finally spotted. He fired at extremely close range, then worked the bolt and fired again as more soldiers appeared. What followed was no longer precision sniping. It was survival. George eventually broke contact and ran toward American lines while Japanese fire snapped through the vegetation behind him. Shortly after 11 o'clock, he reached the American perimeter. The strange experiment with the civilian Winchester had succeeded, but perhaps the most important part of the story came afterward. George's commanders were no longer interested in whether his sporting rifle belonged on a battlefield. They wanted to know whether his skills could be reproduced. Colonel Ferry asked George if he could train other soldiers to operate the same way. The regiment had scoped Springfield rifles available and dozens of men who had already qualified as expert marksmen. George agreed. His only condition was that he be allowed to keep his Winchester. The request was approved. Training began days later. George taught breathing control, trigger technique, wind estimation, concealment, stable shooting positions, and perhaps most importantly, patience. Being an excellent range shooter was not enough. Combat demanded the ability to locate a man who did not want to be seen while avoiding another man trying to do exactly the same thing to you. George eventually organized the soldiers into two-man teams, one shooter, one spotter. The spotter located targets and provided security while the shooter concentrated on the shot. The idea reduced the weakness George himself had experienced while operating alone. The sniper section soon entered combat. According to the account, it achieved dozens of confirmed kills during the final phase of the Guadalcanal campaign while suffering no friendly casualties during its sniper operations. Then, on February 7th, George himself was shot. A Japanese bullet struck his left shoulder. He survived, but his Guadalcanal fighting was finished. 2 days later, American forces reached Cape Esperance. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal was complete. George's war, however, continued. After recovering, he volunteered for another mission involving jungle warfare. He was eventually sent to the unit that became known as Merrill's Marauders. Their mission would take them through northern Burma on exhausting long-range operations behind Japanese lines. George carried the Winchester again, but Burma taught him something different. The rifle remained accurate. George used it successfully against several distant targets during the campaign. Yet much of the fighting happened at extremely short range inside thick jungle. There were situations where a precise bolt-action rifle was invaluable. There were others where the rapid fire of a semi-automatic weapon mattered far more. The lesson was not that George's Winchester was somehow superior to every military rifle. The lesson was that the right weapon became extraordinarily effective when matched with the right man, training, and situation. After Burma, George returned to the United States and trained infantry officers. He never used the Winchester in combat again, but he kept it. And he also kept detailed notes about what he had learned. In 1947, those experiences became a book, Shots Fired in Anger. Rather than presenting himself as a heroic legend, George concentrated on weapons, ammunition, marksmanship, Japanese equipment, and the realities of jungle combat. The book eventually became well known among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. George lived long enough to watch military marksmanship change dramatically. Scoped rifles became purpose-built systems. Sniping developed into a formal military specialty. Training became more organized. Equipment became standardized. Many of the things that had seemed unusual when George walked into Guadalcanal carrying his privately purchased Winchester became normal parts of modern military thinking. John George died in 2009 at the age of 90, and the Winchester Model 70 that other soldiers once mocked survived with him. From a distance, there is nothing particularly dramatic about it. It looks like an old hunting rifle, wooden stock, bolt action, small scope. The kind of weapon that once caused officers to wonder why a soldier was carrying it into a modern war. But that is exactly what makes the story remarkable. The rifle itself was never the secret. George was. Years of competitive shooting had taught him how to breathe, wait, observe, and fire accurately under conditions most soldiers had never trained for. Guadalcanal simply gave those skills a battlefield where they suddenly mattered. A rifle dismissed as a toy became a weapon his commanders wanted copied. A marksman operating alone became an instructor training teams. And a civilian shooting skill became a battlefield capability. Sometimes military innovation begins inside laboratories and factories. And sometimes it begins when one soldier refuses to leave an unusual rifle in his tent. If you enjoy forgotten World War II stories like this, subscribe. Because behind some of the war's most famous battles are smaller stories about individual soldiers, unusual weapons, and ideas that nobody took seriously until they worked.